Well, is everybody all right today? We were in the middle of our discussion of Augustine last time, and I can't emphasize enough how important Augustine is for understanding the whole history of Christianity, the history of Christian ethics, and the history of Western culture as a whole. Because in between Paul, the apostle, and Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and then Luther in the Reformation, Augustine is certainly the most important person right in the middle of those people. Augustine lived at a time when, well, there weren't very many people in the world, and there certainly weren't very many educated people, and there certainly weren't very many geniuses who were able to do such comprehensive work as somebody like Augustine. And so it wasn't as though there were hundreds of different theologians working on this material. So when Augustine spoke, it impacted the whole of the future of Christianity and the whole of the future of Western culture. Not only in our concept of religious and theological things, but in our concept of history and our concept of the nature of humanity and so forth. So we just can't skip Augustine. And one of the most important things about Augustine are not the negative things that we hear about him, but those negative things are important because they do determine how lots of modern people understand the nature of Christianity, particularly Augustine's view of sexuality. And so as we can look out on the screen, we've looked at Augustine's concept of the moral will, the concept of the two cities, which is extremely important for understanding the whole medieval period. His concept of peace and justice, which is important to understand how Christianity moved from a basically pacifist position in the first couple of centuries to a position which actually allowed for just wars, and eventually, though this was not Augustine's view, allowed for the Crusades. In other words, the Crusades were kind of another movement past Augustine, because there's no indication that Augustine would have been interested in the Crusades. But he was interested in providing for the possibility that Christians could go to war if it was properly circumscribed, if it was for the defense of justice. And so the doctrine of the just war comes out of his conception of peace and justice. But then the problematic section is his view of human sexuality. And he did not conclude ultimately that marriage is somehow immoral, but he condemned sexual intercourse for any purpose other than procreation. Now, looking back on it from where we are, you might consider that a very rigid and extreme view. But looking at it from the perspective of Augustine's life, this is a very liberal view compared to the views that he had before he became a Christian. I've already indicated that before he became a Christian, he was raised, his mother was a Christian, but his father was not. So he was raised in a kind of an upper class, or at least middle class, if there is any such thing, kind of Roman paganism. And he had already gotten involved in all kinds of activities in life, including a relationship with a woman. But it was a woman that he never married, and she had a child, so Augustine was a father. But for some reason, and we don't know exactly what all went into this, but for some reason, Augustine had absorbed the kind of negative perspective of sexuality that was a kind of an overriding philosophical air that people breathed at this time. We talk about the recent sexual revolution that has occurred in our time. And most of you are not old enough to have read the Playboy philosophy, which was a kind of a manifesto on the part of the founder of Playboy magazine on the inadequacy of traditional Christian sexual morality. But it had a tremendous impact, even though people kind of made fun of it at the time. It had a tremendous impact. And one of the reasons why it had a tremendous impact, one of the reasons, is because it was partly very true in its critique of some concepts of Christian sexual ethics. In other words, it saw the problematic nature of some Christians' way of understanding ethics. Because ethics to almost everybody is a natural aspect of human existence. And so when they run into a religious perspective that talks about Christian ethic, Christian sexual ethics as if it were an unnatural thing, or as if it were a natural thing that had to be suppressed or overcome in order to be holy, then people are going to have a natural tendency to resist that, even if they claim to be Christians. And so part of the Playboy philosophy was a critique of traditional sexual ethics, which a great many theologians would have agreed with. In fact, Playboy once called itself the widest circulating theological journal in America, in the world, because not only did Hugh Hefner spend a lot of time explaining his philosophy of sex, but he had some theologians writing articles on the subject. I remember he had Harvey Cox and a number of other people talking about sexuality from the perspective of Christianity. And Harvey Cox and some other theologians criticized some of the traditional Christian notions of sexuality in the same way that Hugh Hefner did. Obviously, Hugh went a little bit farther than any of these theologians intended to go. In fact, he went so far that he got in trouble eventually with the developing women's movement, because his concept of women was very low. And so Hugh Hefner's was criticized as much by the secular women's movement as he was by conservative Christians. But the point I'm making is that there is an element of truth in Hugh Hefner's thing, in that he was critiquing a sexual revolution that had occurred centuries before. In fact, he was critiquing a sexual revolution probably that's mostly characterized by what we call Victorianism. A lot of times in America we talk about a person being puritanical. Well, we don't really mean puritanical, because the Puritanicals weren't puritanical. What we generally mean is Victorian, because in many ways the Victorian had a hyper esoteric view of sexuality. The Victorians, were the ones that wanted to put diapers on horses, and wanted to put skirts on clothes on statues, and skirts on piano legs, because we didn't want anything in our society that kind of made people think of sex, and so the 20s was one of the reactions against Victorianism, and then the Hugh Hefner kind of thing that occurred in the 50s and 60s was a second kind of reaction against Victorianism. And I've had books in my library that were written by Victorian physicians, in which the Victorian physician would say something like, and this is the doctor, and so this is the book that a good Victorian upper class person would buy and give to his daughter. And in the book, one of these books, it says that a real cultured Christian young woman will not enjoy sex. She will only participate in it because of the animal nature of her husband. Now these are the physicians of England. And in fact, I dated a girl back in the 60s, early 60s, who had one of these books. And she asked me to read it because her mother had given it to her and it confused her because she was afraid that she was too sinful because she thought she might enjoy sex. And so I had to tell her that that book was probably a little out of date, and that and that I probably wouldn't continue to date a girl who took that book too seriously. Anyway, but the biggest sexual revolution, even greater than the Victorian sexual revolution, was the sexual revolution that took place in the early centuries of the Christian era, because it was a sexual revolution that tended to elevate virginity as a holy state. And that sexual revolution was manifest in several very powerful movements at the time, namely the Manichaeis and Neoplatonists. Obviously, the Romans, the average Roman in the street, didn't pay much attention to these, to this concept of the holiness of virginity. But the people who considered themselves to be very ethical did. And so that was a real sexual revolution in which Augustine himself participated. And that's the reason why Augustine is kind of the transmitter to Western culture and to Western Christian history of this cult of virginity, cult of anti-sexuality. And this happened to him because, for some reason, he had imbibed this kind of aura that that surrounded more philosophical kinds of ethics at the time, who in reaction against Roman excesses reacted, as most people do, in the opposite direction. Just like Hugh Hefner reacted in the opposite direction from what he was reacting to. People in the first few centuries, many of them, those that considered themselves the most ethical and the ones who wanted to be holy, reacted so far from the natural tendencies of human beings that they denied the goodness of the natural tendencies and natural desires and natural pleasures. And so, for some reason, Augustine got hooked up with the Manichaeis, and they are the most extreme of the anti-sexual groups in the early centuries. In order to be a Manichae, you had to vow never to participate in sexual activity. And of course, you wouldn't be married, which is one of the primary reasons why there's no First Manichae Church in Houston, because they did not produce, as long as they remained Manichaees, they did not produce any offspring. So the church had not much chance in growing. It's kind of like the Shakers on the American frontier. They were Manichaees in their understanding of sexuality. They assumed that the time of the end of the world was near, and so if we wanted to get ready for the end of the world and be properly suited for the end of the world, we need to have done without sex for a fairly long time, so that when Jesus came again, we would be pure and holy. Well, there now may be a dozen Shakers in the United States, and at one time they were a fairly large group of people. And the ones that exist, obviously, are not the descendants of the original Shakers. They are people who have been converted because of the attractiveness to some people of this ideal, the ideal of virginity as equal to holiness. And if you read your next chapter after Augustine, which is the chapter on monastic and mystical contributions, the last sentence in that chapter can't let go of Augustine. It says, Augustine's quite negative view of human sexuality continued to cast a long shadow through the medieval centuries and on into the modern world. Luther particularly, and Calvin also, attempted to rehabilitate the goodness of human sexuality. In other words, the Puritans believed in having sex. The idea that the Puritans were puritanical in the sense that they didn't believe in having sex is just a misunderstanding of history. The Puritans and the Lutherans were especially interested in rehabilitating the goodness of sexuality and the goodness of marriage in reaction against medieval monasticism. So even Luther, when Luther broke from the church, or not, he didn't break from the church, but when he broke from the papal authority, he tried to help all of the nuns that he had any influence over to find husbands. And in fact, he found husbands for all of the nuns except one. And so she decided to marry him. And turned out to be a great marriage. But anyway, Luther wasn't really planning on getting married because he thought that would be too self-interested. But he was anyway. But anyway, you had to be married. You had to be married and have a healthy sexual relationship to be a Puritan minister. That's a very different thing from the monasticism of the Middle Ages. So this comes into Christianity because Augustine has been Manichae. Now he realizes eventually the extremism in Manichaeism, so he gets rid of that. But what he enters into then is Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism does not have that affirmative a conception of sexuality either. Neoplatonism is a kind of hyper-spirituality in which the body doesn't play a very positive part. Plato called the body the prison for the soul. Well, if Augustine had been a Jew in Palestine when Christianity arose, I don't think he would have been tempted toward that view, that the body was the prison for the soul, and that the body was essentially not good, and that celibacy was essentially more holy. Because the only Jewish monks there have ever been are Jewish people in Egypt and other places who themselves had been influenced by Manichaeism and Neoplatonism. You don't read about Jewish monks in the Old Testament. In fact, a Jewish priest had to be married, and generally a Jewish rabbi had to be married later. And a Jewish priest, in fact, had to have a woman selected to be prepared if he died while he was in the temple. If his wife died while he was in the temple offering sacrifices, he had to have a woman selected to be married to, so he could continue the potency of his priesthood. So, in order to be a priest in Judaism, you had to be married. And so it's much later in the history of the church that in order to be a priest, marriage was dispensable. Well, that's quite a change. And the reason why that change happened was because of this incredible sexual revolution that took place in the early centuries and affected the church so much. When Augustine became a Christian, he developed a much more positive concept of sexuality. He just didn't develop as positive a conception of sexuality as he should have gotten from his biblical studies. And so, for instance, he decided that marriage was good, as long as it was primarily for procreation. But he decided not to get married himself, which I think, it's hard to know what would go on in somebody's mind. But sometimes I try to think of what might have gone on in somebody's mind. I've tried to think of what might have gone on in the mind of either Jesus or Paul if Augustine had come to them for advice on what to do about this woman that he had been related to before he became a Christian. What do you think Paul's advice would have been?
Well, I think Paul would have given him advice to go ahead and get married and make that child legitimate.
Yeah, I think Paul was not married himself when he wrote his material when he was a Christian missionary. But most scholars assume that Paul was married at one time, since he was a Jewish rabbi, and there was nothing in Judaism itself that would have tended toward the denigration of marriage. So most scholars assume that Paul may have been married at one time, and that he was either a person who had lost his wife through death or was a divorcee. There were lots of divorces among rabbis at the time, and there were lots of women who died. Women didn't live very long in comparison with their men as they do in present times. And so, and certainly Paul was not anti-sexuality or anti-marriage. He talks about marriage and sexuality in the highest terms that anybody thus far in history had ever talked about. So he certainly would, in fact, he gave advice to people that you should get married. Sometimes it's better not to get married. For instance, in these present times when there are persecutions going on and maybe the end of the world is coming close, maybe you shouldn't get married. But if you can't be properly related to your fiancé or to your girlfriend, you should go ahead and get married, because you would be tempted to sin against her if you did not go ahead and get married. So I think that's what Paul would have told Augustine. You need to go back and find that woman and bring her in and take care of her, make your child legitimate, be a good family man. That was what was required of bishops in the New Testament. If you read 1 Timothy, and it gives the qualifications of bishops, and one of the qualifications of bishops is that they be the husband of one wife and that they have children who are strong in the faith. It was assumed by the Jews that their elders would be married and have children. Otherwise, how could they have the experience to be the elders or the shepherds of other members of the community? And that was true even of the early Gentile Christian communities. It was assumed that they call their elders bishops, but it was assumed that their bishops would be married and have children also, and that how they took care of their wife and their children was evidence as to whether they were qualified to be bishops or not. So the later thing you can see developing from this anti-sexual revolution that took place in between the time of the writing of the New Testament and the Middle Ages. But Augustine still had the problem, even though his view of sexuality was more positive than it was in his early life, that sexual intercourse not for procreation is an expression of lust. In other words, he still had a negative conception of sexual desire. Now, lust really is an English word that is neutral. Lust does not necessarily mean something bad, but it used to just mean sexual desire. But now that Augustine and other Christian people have put this kind of onus on Christian sexuality, we almost always use the term lust now for improper sexual desire. And a great many Christians, like Augustine evidently, considered any kind of sexual desire as kind of lust. And a lot of people read Jesus and Paul as if they were Augustinians or Neoplatonists. For instance, when Jesus said that whoever looks at a woman and lusts after her, that's in the Old English version, he has already committed adultery in his heart. That has messed up the thinking of lots of people over the centuries, because they do not understand the context in which that was stated. The context in which Jesus states that is in the Sermon on the Mount, when he is trying to explain the meaning of the Ten Commandments, of the law. And what he's trying to say, he's already said it, for instance, about murder. He says, what goes on in your sinful activity has already begun in your mind. So if you hate your brother in your mind, you have already committed murder. Now that doesn't mean it's better, since you've already committed murder in your mind, to go ahead and shoot him. But it does mean that if you hate your brother, you have already committed a sin in your heart. You still ought to stop and go home. But you shouldn't consider yourself to be so morally pure just because you missed. You shot and missed. That doesn't clear you from the sin of being a murderer. And so that's exactly the same kind of thing he's meaning when he talks about sexuality. If you look at a woman and you would actually misuse her, mistreat her, you would destroy your relationship with your own wife, you would destroy the vow and the commitment you had made to your own wife, you would do that if you had a chance. Just because you're too ugly to do it doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't already committed the sin. You know, you may not get her interested, but that doesn't mean you've already committed the sin. And so lusting in your heart after a woman is the same thing as hating your brother. It is a sin because if you got a chance, you would destroy something very important. It does not mean sexual desire. Now, it's hard for human beings to keep sexual desire and lust apart. There's no doubt about that. But sexual desire per se is never considered to be a sin in either the Old or the New Testament. And Augustine evidently was not able ever to make that distinction between sexual desire per se and sexual pleasure per se and lust. And so that casts a pall over the whole Middle Ages and over the whole rest of the history of Christianity. Because even not only the medieval church, but a lot of Protestant churches have continued this kind of schizophrenia of believing that sex is good all of a sudden, but before it's good, it's almost always bad in terms of even the way you feel or the way you think. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the monastics for a little while. But the last important thing that Augustine did, and this was a little bit more positive, and that is to emphasize that wealth is not an evil in itself. It is a part of God's creation, and like the rest of creation, it is good. Now, if he had been that strong on his understanding of sexuality, then we'd all been better off. But like the rest of creation, it is good as it is good to God. It is not good in itself. To enjoy anything means to cling to it with affection for its own sake. To use a thing is to employ what we have received for our use to obtain what we want, provided that it is right for us to want it. Now, I think a great many theologians these days would probably consider this distinction to be kind of precious, that is, a little bit too subtle. Because I think from the biblical perspective, it is not too extreme to simply say that whatever God has created is good. And but it is true that whatever God has created is good, but it may become idolatrous, or it may become something that participates in sin if we are improperly related to it. And that's basically what I think he wanted to say, but I don't know whether we would want necessarily to use the same language he did. It is a perversion for people to want to enjoy money, but merely to make use of God. Well, that's true, the whole sentence, if you put the whole sentence together. We don't want to use God and enjoy money. Such people do not spend money for the sake of God, but worship God for the sake of money. Wealth, accordingly, is an instrumental value, not an intrinsic one. Now, we've had a lot to say about this throughout the whole history of Christianity so far. And let me just sum up some of the problems that are going to continue to exist as we look into Christian ethics. There is the tendency, because of this anti-creation revolution that took place in the early centuries from the Manichaeis and the Neoplatonists, to consider anything that is of this world, that gives pleasure, that is that's not, quote, spirit or spiritual, to be somehow not of any value. And that is not a view that you can get from the Bible, either the Old or the New Testament. And so the tendency that some people have to elevate poverty or virginity as though these were holier states of human life is simply not in accord with the biblical, either the New Testament or the Old Testament view of human nature. No one is ever commanded to be poor as the proper state of things. People are commanded, in fact, in the Old and New Testament both, to pay attention to the poor, because the poor are in a situation that God did not intend them to be. And so there's one instance in the New Testament which sometimes confuses people. And that's where Jesus is talking to a man who's called a rich young ruler. And the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and asks him, "What must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus says, well, you should keep the commandments. You know, you should not commit adultery, you should do all these 10 commandments. And the rich young ruler says, well, I've done all of these all my life. And Jesus says, that's great. But there's one thing you lack. You need to sell all that you have and give to the poor. Now, a lot of people have taken that as a kind of a general rule for Christianity. Well, in order to do that, you're taking it out of context. Because Jesus himself used money. He used money that was supplied to him by fairly wealthy women who were part of his disciples. He had some friends who were fairly wealthy people, Lazarus and his family. And as far as we know, Jesus never told Lazarus that in order to be his disciple, he had to sell everything that he had and give to the poor. Why do you think he might have told this person that then? Yeah.
Because the rich young ruler, I guess, was letting the money run his life, or he was, his ethics were based on his money.
Okay, Jesus seemed to have been making a spiritual judgment, because he ate dinner. Several of the stories in the New Testament are stories in which he ate dinner with wealthy people. And he never told any of those people that they needed to sell all they had. He did tell them that they should take care of the poor. And because from Jesus' perspective, wealth did not belong to human beings. Even if you had a lot of it, it didn't belong to you. It belonged to God. God was giving it to you. And so you had a responsibility of using it. Not using God, but using money. Now, an interesting thing is that after Jesus said this, his apostles asked him, Jesus said, when the young ruler went off without replying positively, Jesus said, the apostles said, well, who then can be saved? Because Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. Well, the apostles said, who then can be saved? And Jesus' answer is really a more radical one than what I've been talking about today. What he says is, it's impossible for a rich man to be saved. But it's impossible for everyone to be saved. In other words, he's making a radical statement about grace. He's telling his disciples, don't look at this rich man as if he were a worse sinner than the rest of it. Because it's impossible to be saved, but all things are possible with God. So what he's saying there is similar to what he's saying in the Sermon on the Mount. That is, that it's not possible for a human being to keep the law. It's not possible for a human being to go through his whole life without hating anybody, or to go through his whole life without committing adultery in his heart, or to go through his whole life without covetousness, which is stealing in your mind. It's impossible for a human being to go through his whole life without that. So in a sense, the Sermon on the Mount is setting us up for the concept of grace, which Paul later delineates and elaborates on. In other words, Paul carries it further in a kind of a systematic way by saying, you can't be justified by the law. So this rich man could not be justified by the law. And the people who listened to Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount could not be justified by the law, because there was no one there who completely matched up to the ethics of Jesus. The ethics of Jesus are an impossible possibility, as one theologian says. They're a possible impossibility. Speaking of Playboy, back when Jimmy Carter was president, he gave a interview to Playboy. Any of you ever heard about that? He gave an interview to Playboy, and of course, the only reason why Playboy ever gives an interview is to try to get something on somebody. So they asked him if he had ever committed adultery, because they knew at that time that Kennedy had done this a number of times, so they wanted to get Carter, since he claimed to be a born-again Baptist. Did you ever commit adultery? And he said, yes. He says, I've committed adultery probably a number of times in my heart. And then he quoted Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Well, of course, the media didn't put it in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. They just put across the headlines, Carter says he committed adultery. And the next day there were these cartoons on the page where Carter is walking past a woman on the street and she's holding her skirts together so he won't commit adultery with her. Carter was Carter's a Sunday school teacher, so he was trying to explain to this writer in Playboy what Jesus meant by that. But it got right past this guy. But it gets past a lot of Americans, because that idea that you can commit adultery in your heart or in your mind just does not compute to people, because they equate it with sexual desire. So what you have to do in order to understand what Jesus is saying is you should distinguish between committing adultery in your heart from sexual desire. Sexual desire is natural. It's the creation of God. He thought it was a good idea. It was his idea. But the misuse of sexual desire, the idolatry of sexual desire, is what Jesus in the New Testament is talking about. So the idolatry of wealth is what the Bible warns us against, not wealth itself. Now, before we get into the Reformers, let me say just a word or two about the two chapters in between. One is a chapter on monastic and mystical contributions to Christian ethics, and the other is the chapter on the confessional. Well, contemporary Christian ethics generally, particularly Protestant Christian ethics, generally does not pay as much attention to the monastic and the mystical contributions of the medieval church, for the reasons that we've been talking about. the monastic tradition, in some monastic traditions, tends to toward a kind of hyper-individualistic spirituality, in which your main goal in life is to get closer to God, like everybody else is not able to. Well, there were some monastic communities who were more communal than that, and they considered themselves to be doing something for the church. And a lot of members of the church thought that they were doing something important for the church, so they would support these monastic communities. The monastic communities were being righteous for the people who could not be righteous. Well, so that had a salutary effect on a lot of medieval ethics, but on the other hand, it divided Christian ethics into a kind of ethics that really righteous people can do, and the kind of ethics that really righteous people can't do, and so they have to live on a different level. This was part of the problem that the Reformers really reacted against. That is, that there were two kinds of ethics. There were two sets of ethics. One for a group of people who were really holy, and the other was for the rest of us. And that was the ethic, for instance, that the Calvinists and the Puritans were reacting against. The Calvinists did not believe that they were righteous. They believed that they could not be righteous, but that they were in the same boat as everyone else. So their righteousness had to come as a gift from God. Whereas some of the monastics kind of left the impression that their righteousness was righteousness that they produced. And a lot of people had the idea that the monastics produced enough righteousness, the monastics and the saints produced enough righteousness that it could actually be banked. That is, it could go into the treasury of the saints and be available to those people who couldn't produce righteousness to be received through indulgences or some other kind of thing. So the monastic idea of righteousness for the few, the few being righteous for everybody else, eventually ended up being misused through the indulgence controversy, and that, of course, was one of the primary things that produced the Reformation. From the Reformation perspective, no one can be righteous enough to have any left over to put into a bank or to put into a treasury. No one, in fact, can be righteous enough to escape hell or to go to heaven, much less have enough left over to give to somebody else to escape purgatory or something like that. No one had enough righteousness enough, so they had to depend upon the righteousness of God, however saintly they were. So, in a sense, certainly for Reformation ethics, monasticism was a kind of a diversion in which, from the perspective of the Reformers, the church had spent a long time trying to be justified by works, or justified by their own righteousness. And they considered that to be to have a very negative effect on the Christian gospel and on Christian ethics. Now, mysticism is a little bit more of a complicated thing, because everybody, just about, when they think of mysticism, they think of a higher level of spirituality. And that's certainly true of Christianity. In fact, there is a growing interest in Christianity of mystical kinds of activity, mystical kinds of experience. It's all labeled these days under the label spirituality. But one thing we have to understand is that spirituality is a very broad label, and it includes everything from witchcraft to high Catholic mysticism. And so just because somebody says they're going to bring you, spirituality, doesn't mean you know what they're talking about. You better listen to them, because they may be bringing you a spirituality which tells you that if you put your trash can in this corner of the house that you'll be wealthy, and if you put it in the other corner of the house you'll be poor. And that's kind of a spirituality, but it's not very related to Christianity. And some of the mystics of the Middle Ages are some of the great Christians of history. My favorite hymn, for instance, in all Christian hymnody was written by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a mystic. And some of the great women in the history of the church were medieval mystics, because that's the place where they could really shine. And people wouldn't put them down because they figured that they were getting these revelations or these mystical experiences from God, and of course you couldn't tell God not to do something. So this was an opportunity for women to really become influential, not only in their own time, but in later times. And the concept of the mystical experience of God is still a very attractive idea, and it is not totally antithetical even to Protestant ethics. But Protestant ethics, like Jewish ethics, is not primarily mystical. A mystic is primarily mystical, but Jewish and Christian ethics and Protestant ethics are not primarily mystical. Jesus was not a mystic. Abraham was not a mystic. Moses was not a mystic in the sense of mysticism, for instance, of the East. A Hindu mystic or a Buddhist mystic is doing something quite differently from what Moses and Jesus and Paul were doing. Jesus and Paul and Moses and Abraham have mystical elements, depending on how you use the word, but they were not mystics. Muhammad was not a mystic, but sometimes modern religious people just kind of assume that any important religious founder in the history of the world must have been a mystic. Well, that depends on what their view of God and nature is. If they view nature as of not being much value and only the experience of God being of any value, then they will tend to be mystical. If they view nature as kind of an illusion, or as a kind of a trap, or as a kind of a prison, then the only character of their spirituality will be kind of a mystical thing. But Jesus didn't go around going into trances. He probably meditated some, but he never meditated in the sense that a mystic meditates. Yes?
How do mystics know they're mystics? I mean, does God tell them? Or do they just have some experiences and they figure it out? So how do you know when you're a mystic, or when you're just having strange experiences?
You have to, in a sense, be trained in mystical exercises, which is a kind of school of spirituality that grows up. And mystical experience, it has to be preceded by very intense spiritual exercises. You know, learning how to pray deeply, learning how to contemplate God deeply, learning how to meditate deeply. The mystical experiences involves trying to simply clean out of your head and out of your experience everything that's worldly. And the more you're able to clean that out, the more you're able to have a vision of God, which is purely spiritual. Now, what I'm saying is that that is a very attractive kind of spirituality. But if you read the Bible, you don't find Moses or Jesus or Paul spending a great deal of time trying to do that. They spend a great deal of time in prayer. They may even spend a good deal of time in meditation, but they spend most of their time doing something. So their primary focus is not mysticism. They have some mystical elements. For instance, you can say that the church is the mystical body of Christ. Or you can say that the sacraments are mystical in a certain sense. But that's not the primary focus of Christian life, is mystical experience. Now, I enjoy talking to people, even Christians, who talk about their mystical experiences, and it's really kind of attractive. But on the other hand, some of the people that I've known who were Christians who got involved in mystical experiences, there's a trade-off. They are not involved almost any at all in ethical activity. In other words, they're not concerned about social ethics, or environmental ethics, or political ethics, or any of these kinds of things, because they're too close to God, if you understand what I'm saying. So I know one man, for instance, who got involved in some hyper-mystical programs, and he was a good friend of mine, and so it bothered me that the more he got involved in his hyper-mystical programs, the less involved he was with his wife and family. And that's one of the serious ethical defects of mysticism from the Christian perspective. That, of course, is the reason why these mystics did not have a wife and family. Because if you have a wife and family, then you ought to think twice before you get too involved in mystical kinds of exercises, because you may treat your wife as if she's of no importance in your life. So there's a good reason why mysticism and monasticism goes together. And there's a good reason why other kinds of ethics, which emphasize ethics of family and community and social and political and environmental and other kinds of ethics, do not really spend very much time on mystical exercises. Anybody else have a question about that? Now, that's not meant to condemn this kind of spirituality, you know. God has lots of ways of relating to people. But it's just to say that human beings have certain kind of limitations. And if I separate myself completely from the life of the world, including separate myself from having a family, then there's some ways in which I'm not going to be of much help to people that I'm supposed to take care of and I'm supposed to love. It may sound that I'm too negative about monasticism, but I can't help but be a little bit more negative about monasticism, because I think that it is in many ways a diversion from the ethics of the Bible. The ethics of the Bible is the ethics of being in the world and not trying to be completely out of the world. There are a lot of ethics today among Protestants that are kind of otherworldly. For instance, people sometimes sell all their possessions and go up and stay on a mountaintop because somebody's told them that Jesus is coming again. To me, that is a misunderstanding of Christian ethics, or of Christian eschatology. From my perspective, if you're going to be, quote, ready for Jesus to come, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be doing what you're supposed to be doing in the world. If you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in the world to help people and to take care of your family and to do whatever needs to be done, then you're not ready for Jesus to come. If you desert them, like some modern cults do, then that's too spiritual. From the biblical perspective, to be spiritual means to take care of your body, to use it as a temple of the Holy Spirit, to take care of your family, to take care of your community, to take care of your society to whatever extent you can. In other words, Christian ethics is an ethic for this world with these people under these circumstances. It's not an otherworldly ethic. We don't even know what we're going to be doing if we go to heaven, but we know what we're supposed to do if we're on earth. You were going to say something?
So mysticism, or the mystic mentality, is kind of based upon a misconception of God and then of an individual's misconception of that relationship to God?
Well, I can't make an ultimate judgment on that, but what I'm trying to say is that mysticism is not a continuation of the biblical understanding of God and the nature of man. Mysticism is more in the tradition of Neoplatonism and other kinds of views of God. Now, I have no doubt that these experiences are very salutary for people who experience them. All I'm saying is that if that is the total focus of life, is mystical experience, then we're not really trying to live very much in this life. We're trying to escape this life into another kind of realm.
I wonder if some of this is based upon Paul's references to he knew someone who was in the third heaven. And
Yeah.
if that has looking at that, then that's almost as an example that Christians should follow that same type of ethic.
Well, there's no necessary exclusion from Christianity or Judaism visions and mystical experiences. What I'm saying is that mysticism is not the focus. Mysticism is the focus of Hinduism. It's the focus of Neoplatonism. It's the focus of Gnosticism. And so what I'm saying, I'm not making a judgment. It may be that the Gnostics are right. All I'm saying is that if you go the Gnostic route, then you're not going to have time to be a Christian ethicist. Or if you go the mystical route, then you're not going to have time to be a Christian ethicist, because you're concerned primarily with the way you feel and the way you as an individual are related to God. And Christians and Jews feel like that they should be related to God properly so that they can be properly related to everyone else. But if you take yourself away from relationships with everyone else, then that produces a problem.
My question is can you just be like a normal Christian out there walking around, and have some mystical whoa experience? What is that called? Where are you then? If
Well,
you're not mystic or monastic?
No, I'm trying to distinguish between, for instance, you try to distinguish between a revelational faith and a philosophical faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is no revelation in philosophy and no philosophy in revelation. In the same way, you distinguish between a mystical faith and a non-mystical faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are not any mystical elements in a non-mystical faith. There have always been kind of mystical experiences that Christians have had. For instance, say John Wesley was a Anglican priest for a number of years, and he was a missionary. And it's only on a boat trip, on a ship trip one time, that he runs into some Christians who were a little bit more mystical. And in studying with them, he has what is called a heart strangely warmed. Well, that's obviously a kind of a mystical experience. But that didn't change him into a mystic. he still went around doing mission work and remained an Anglican minister and did the same things he did, except now he did them with more power and more vitality. And so he testifies to this kind of experience. And there's no way for us to judge those experiences because, we don't know what happened. I know a lot of people who, even Christians, who just say bah humbug when somebody comes up and tells them about an experience, even if it's a mystical experience. I don't have any basis upon which to deny or to judge somebody else's experience. All I'm saying is that the primary trajectory of Christianity and Judaism is not having these experiences. Even if you have these experiences, according to the New Testament, they have to be judged by the Word of God. In other words, you're not going to get a revelation that is in contradiction to the primary revelation that comes through Jesus Christ in the Word of God. And the same for Jews. You're not going to get a mystical revelation that is in contradiction to the Bible. So the trajectory is primarily living in this world, having natural relationships, because these are created by God and they're good, and treating people the way you're supposed to be treated. There were a group of people in Thessalonica who, for instance, decided that Jesus was going to come very soon, so they kind of developed this mystical community in which they sat around waiting for the second coming of Christ. And Paul says for them to go to work. That's where that famous statement is, if you don't work, you should not eat. He was talking to people who were giving up the ordinary things of life as if that was more spiritual. He said, go to work. If you don't take care of your family, then you're worse than an unbeliever. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. You just have, there are mystical experiences on the fringes of Christianity and Judaism, but that's not its primary focus. And I would like to have a few of those mystical experiences. I haven't had very many of them. I guess I'm too much of an empiricist. And so I haven't had some of the mystical experiences even some of my good friends have had. Maybe something will come along and knock me up the side of the head one of these days. Okay, anything else about that? All right. We've skipped in our class discussion the chapter on Thomas Aquinas. That's not because it's not important for us to know something about it. That's the reason why we have given you an assignment to look into it. But we'll have to make reference to it when we talk about the Reformers, because the Reformers are reformers of the church that was primarily influenced by Thomas Aquinas. The Reformation burst on the scene in the early 16th century, breaking the medieval world apart and recasting the religious and political map of Europe. It is a perversion for people to... Oh, wait a minute, I went back the wrong way. Luther and Christian liberty. We are not saved by such works, nor by the laws that command them. We are saved by faith. Now you have to understand Luther's context. Luther himself became a monk because while he was working in the study of the law, he had so many spiritual struggles in his mind that he had come to the conclusion that a great many people in his day had come to. In fact, there were some times during this period in which there were too many monks to be supported by the people left. Just like in a few years there are going to be too many old people on Social Security that are to be supported by the people who are working. And that's something we got to worry about. I don't have to worry about it because I was born 5 years a little earlier. So, but it's you people that were born later that are going to have to worry about that. But in the same way, a lot of people, so many people became monks at certain periods during this time that it looked like there were not enough people left to support these monks. But this was a natural thing for people to do, because if they are very sensitive about their spiritual life, and if they really want to be saved, this was put forth as the way to do it. Luther's father hated it when he became a monk, because he wanted him to make a good living and take care of his family and so forth. But Luther decided that he'd go to hell if he didn't become a monk. So he tried extremely hard to be a monk. He beat himself. You know, some monasteries had these beating things, cat of nine tails that they had hanging up in there. And he would beat himself, thinking that the more he beat himself, the more God would say, well, okay, that's enough, you know, and he'd forgive him his sins. But no matter how much he beat himself, no matter how much he confessed his sin, he still could not feel justified in the presence of God. So he came to a spiritual crisis. He had a good supervisor whose name was Staupitz, who thought that Luther was being a little extreme, because there's no doubt that Luther was being extreme. And Staupitz tried to get him to lighten up a little bit. But Luther was just too intense to lighten up. From his perspective, if he had to be saved by being righteous, then he was in bad trouble, because he could think of more things to confess than any confessor had ever heard. And the problem was, it wasn't because he did so many worse things than anybody else did. It's because he was more sensitive to how profound sin is. So he would confess things that confessors didn't even have any rules for. And they had rules for everything. If you read the chapter on confession, they had rules. For instance, if you ate too much and vomited, you had to confess that, and it was there was so much penance put on you. If you ate too much and vomited out the host in the sacrament, it was several times as much penance, and so on. So you had these manuals of penance that had everything listed that people could think of, and of course they were continually added to. And evidently Luther went through these manuals and thought up things of his own that these manuals had not thought of. But he could never feel relief. Now, some secular authors have claimed that Luther finally found relief when he went up in the tower one day after having constipation for quite a while. And he found relief when his constipation broke. And that's when he realized the grace of God. Well, that may have had something to do with it. You know, I said before that how your stomach feels is a very important ethical question. But the theological basis for his concept of grace came from his study of the Psalms, because he was put into the job of being a teacher of the Bible. So he studied the Psalms, he studied the book of Romans. And from the study of the Psalms, let me just tell you what psalm he studied. He studied the psalm that says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And he recognized that because that is quoted in the New Testament. Where is it quoted in the New Testament? On the cross. Jesus quotes the psalm and says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that slaps Luther up the side of the head, so to speak. Says, what in the world is this? Jesus is saying that God has forsaken me? I thought God had forsaken me. Why has God forsaken his own Son? And it finally dawned on him that the reason why Jesus quotes this, and the reason why it's quoted in the New Testament, is because the early church understood Jesus as being forsaken so that we did not have to be forsaken. In other words, we could never confess enough and get enough penance to be saved. But we didn't have to confess enough and get enough penance to be saved, because Christ had been forsaken so that we do not have to be. Now that's really a very, I wouldn't say it's a simple idea, but it's certainly an idea that had not crossed his mind, because he still pictured Jesus like Jesus was pictured in some of the big cathedrals, you know, as the judge sitting up above the whole congregation, and down below people being thrown into hell and so forth. So Jesus is the righteous judge. He didn't consider Jesus to be evil, but he considered Jesus to be such a righteous judge that from his perspective, Jesus' righteousness was evil, because he could not possibly live up to it. And so if he couldn't possibly live up to it, then he couldn't get relief from his sense of being lost and damned. So it's only after he sees Jesus' own statement, his own quotation on the cross, that he realizes that if Jesus himself can say, "I am forsaken," then that must mean something for me, that my forsakenness is not ultimate. And so then he begins to learn something about Paul's conception of being in Christ. If we are in Christ, then we have already been forsaken and received back again. And that's when he reads in Romans, where it says, "The just shall live by faith," or by faith the just shall live. In other words, it's by faith that the just are saved, not by works. So he puts those two things together. And so out of this comes, I guess you can call it another mystical experience. It's certainly a transformational experience, to where he realizes now that he's not any less a sinner than he was before, but he is now a saint in the New Testament sense. In the New Testament sense, all Christians are saints. It's only later that the word saint is used to refer just to specific kinds of Christians. In the New Testament, all Christians are saints. That is, they are at the same time, Luther realized, Christians are at the same time sinners and saints. They are sinners because of what they have done. They are saints because of what Christ has done. Christ has been forsaken for me, therefore I do not have to be forsaken if I have trust or I put my faith in him. So that's kind of the individual theological conclusion that Luther comes to, which causes him to reject monasticism, to reject what he calls works righteousness, to reject what he calls the elevation or the adoration of relics and other things that seem to give spiritual benefits for human activity. And he accepts only benefits, salvation benefits, that are received from God as gift. So that's where righteousness and faith go together. The righteous will live by faith. The word just and righteous are the same word in the Bible. So the righteous shall live by faith. The ordinary idea is that the righteous shall live by works. So he's latched on to Paul's radical conception of grace. And he's latched on to Augustine's. He was an Augustinian monk, but if he had known Augustine better, he wouldn't have had near the problem he had with understanding the Christian faith. So Augustine is a Paulinist who attempts to interpret the idea of justification by grace through faith. So Luther, in a sense, goes back through Augustine to Paul. But his primary impulse is studying the Scripture and reading things that he had just never noticed before, even though he had been a teacher of these things. Now, next time we will complete this survey of the Reformation and go on into some other.